with David Miliband, hosted by James Libson. David is the son of refugees, and he hugely advanced the UK's human rights agenda during his time as Foreign Secretary, and went on to become the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, where he's brought his global vision and leadership to help hundreds of thousands of people whose lives and livelihoods are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and regain full control of their future. James is a leading international lawyer with a strong personal interest in refugee work, including as chairperson of World Jewish Relief when it initiated its Refugee Employment Initiative, which you'll hear more about tomorrow. And James now chairs the board of Prism the Gift Fund, which is the charity home, the umbrella for a number of refugee organizations. I think at the time when we were working in Greece, it was something like 30 organizations, some of which are represented here today, including Help Refugees, RTI, and RefuAid. James, over to you and to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kumars, and everyone else. It's really a great privilege to be part of this launch today. I feel very underqualified. It's lovely to see familiar faces, but also so many faces from different areas of work in the wider community. And it's also a great privilege for me to be in discussion with David Miliband. You've had an introduction, a very brief introduction from David about his achievements. People will know David and all of the public positions he's taken. He's been a friend of mine for over 15 years now. And during that time, I have very much enjoyed the friendship, all of our associations, the things he's done over the years on behalf of organizations that I have been close to. I'm very deeply appreciative. The one thing that people always say to me when they know that I know David is they say to me, they bewail the loss to our public life, the UK public life, by him not being involved in it in the way that people had hoped and perhaps expected. And my answer to them always is that he's doing such incredible work at the IRC and has changed that organisation so fundamentally to deliver work and aid and assistance in the key areas of the world that have needed it so desperately over the last few years, that our loss is the world's gain. And I really do believe that. And his work at the IRC has just been fantastic to watch and absolutely inspirational. So with those words, I'm going to, David, the point of having David here today is to give us an overview of the world in which people are working, perhaps a global view as against some of the more local views that people, the environments that people are working in at the moment. So David, perhaps you could just start. Welcome, first of all. It's lovely to see you.
I always do what you tell me. So when you said that I had to be here on Monday morning New York time, I put it in my diary. So it's always nice to have a conversation with you. And if there are other people happy to listen, then I'm happy to join in.
Thank you. Thank you. So David, perhaps we can start with an overview. Where we are, beginning of August 2020, not where anyone expected to be. Give us an overview of how you see the world, the refugee situation in the world at the moment.
So let me just divide my remarks into three, James. First of all, just to introduce the International Rescue Committee to the audience here. We're a global humanitarian charity and a refugee resettlement agency in the United States, the largest refugee resettlement agency in the US. We were founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to rescue Jews from Europe. We're a secular agency. We now work in 200 field sites, 40 countries around the world, countries that are at war or in conflict, countries that are hosting refugees, or countries that are part of the refugee transit routes. Finally, we also help resettle refugees in the US, and now we're actually offering technical advice in Germany as well, which is a rather interesting return to our roots. We have about 13,000 employees and 17,000 daily volunteers who are paid around the world. And so we're obviously a large organization focused on survival, recovery, and helping people gain control of their futures, as David Altshuler said at the beginning. So we have got a global view, albeit one that is focused on countries that are poor or lower middle income, but with some insight into what's going on in richer countries. And just to state the obvious, it's a source of some grief to me that rich countries like the UK and the US think that they're hosting most refugees, but actually are hosting very small numbers compared to countries like Bangladesh or Uganda or Lebanon, which have very large numbers of refugees. And the numbers coming into the US, even under the Dubs scheme, which has been cruelly abandoned in various ways by the government, into the UK is very small indeed. We don't actually deliver services in the UK, although we have an important office in the UK that manages our relationships with government, with civil society, and with the media. So that's just an introduction to the International Rescue Committee. Secondly, we went into the COVID crisis in a state of crisis, record numbers of people displaced by conflict and persecution around the world. The latest UN figures actually just came out in June, and we now know that 79.5 million, 80 million for the sake of argument, people have been displaced by conflict and persecution. About 45 million of them are internally displaced, so they haven't left their own home country. They're homeless within their own country. Northwest Syria being a prime example of that. You've got 1.5 million people displaced from other parts of Syria. There's more or less, in addition to that, 45 million, another 26 million or so refugees, and then about 3.5, 4 million asylum seekers as well, in growing numbers. And these people are myth-busting in all sorts of ways. They're in poor countries, not in rich countries. 86% of them are in poor or lower middle-income countries rather than richer parts of the world. They're in urban areas, not in camps. 60% of refugees are in urban areas, not in camp settings. Less than 3% of them went home last year, so the displacement is long-term, not short-term. The averages are not great, but we know more or less 20 years. It's a multi-generational situation to be a refugee. And we also know that about half of them are under the age of 18. So it's the demography of this population is significantly skewed towards younger populations. We also know that the humanitarian aid system of which the International Rescue Committee is part is in various ways ill-suited to the modern nature of the refugee crisis, in that the traditional model of humanitarian aid is that you keep people alive through health and food before they go home. But if they're not going home, then what are you doing for them? Less than 2% or less than 3% of the global humanitarian aid budget goes on education, despite the fact that half of the world's refugees are under the age of 18. So you can see the mismatch there. We're an $850 million organization now, but of our $600 million in government grants, the vast majority of them are for 1 year. So we're dealing with long-term problems with short-term solutions, and that speaks. Let me just say a final word, particularly relevant, I think, to some of the organizations that represent on this call. Refugee resettlement, which is the organized transfer of refugees from one country to another, and their integration into national life, is in a state of almost collapse. It's never been a huge number of people helped by it. But ironically, in some ways, it was Ronald Reagan who admitted more refugees to America than any other American president, 210,000 in the early 1980s. The Trump administration has reduced the number of refugees coming by the resettlement route into America down to about 13,000 this year. And that's important because America has traditionally taken more of the resettlement numbers than any other country, the majority, in fact, not just the plurality. And as American numbers of refugees being resettled has been reduced, so other countries have reduced as well. And I'm afraid the UK has been working with that, has been going along with that. Europe, the European Union, hasn't really had a resettlement program until now. We're arguing very strongly that Europe needs to come in and fill the void. And there is a package now sitting, waiting for negotiations between the European Parliament and the European Commission to get this done. Third part of the introduction, I apologize for the scale of the answer, but it was a very broad-ranging question. Is COVID, because this is any discussion that doesn't mention COVID is making a grave error. In the places that we work, we've got to reckon it's 3, 4, 5 years before a vaccine really brings back any kind of normality. COVID, to our mind, represents a double emergency that we serve. It's a health threat, and the case positivity rate, the test positivity ratios in many of the places that we work, that's the proportion of people who are testing positive as a proportion of the number of tests, 20, 30, 40% suggests that there's massive under-reporting of the level of COVID. And it's an obvious health threat. It's also an economic threat because people living on the edges when the economy turns down, they bear the fullest brunt of it. And we're very, very concerned that the vacuum of global leadership at the moment means that aid flows are very low. The US pitifully low, and historically been the largest humanitarian aid donor, pitifully low. Even DFID, which has been a staunch and good supporter of humanitarian aid, it's been really struggling to cope with the nature of the crisis, and now it's involved in a reorganization, which has obviously set it back. So I think it's really important to say that COVID is hitting the most vulnerable hardest, not just in rich countries. You know that from the figures in the UK, that it's been poor communities, often Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, that have been hit hardest by COVID in richer countries. But it's also true in the poorest countries that they are being hit hard, that they're going to be hit the hardest. And it's some of the people that we serve who are on the receiving end of it. So I think COVID is a complicating, exacerbating factor in the work that we do.
David, thank you very much for that overview. A very good place to start. I want to drill down a little bit on some of those answers. I should say that if anyone has some questions they want to ask, please use the chat function. You can send them direct to me, and I will try and look out for them as we're going through this conversation. But just drilling down a little bit, what are the top priorities based on that analysis of where we are? What are you actually working on? Recognizing the inability for you and your staff to travel perhaps has been limited, and how are you prioritizing the various tasks that face you?
Yeah, I mean, we've moved to fully remote operations, and the drive we've got to hire locally has been by the COVID crisis. I'm not sure if you're getting a lot of feedback, so if someone's on...
some people, yeah, I think some people aren't on mute. Everyone should be on mute. It would help, I think.
Will help us have the conversation. Look, I think that it's really important to say that the priority starts with life-saving. We've got to be, first of all, concerned with issues of healthcare for those whose lives are threatened, with malnutrition, which is a significant issue. There's a real hunger crisis coming, which is a symptom of the economic impact of COVID. Never mind the fact that 80% of the world's acutely malnourished under fives are not getting help even before the COVID
Millhouse, yeah.
start. I'm not
Right,
quite
Millhouse.
So I don't know whether you're feeling that as well, James. So we're having quite a lot of.
Yeah, can I ask everyone to go on mute because we keep on getting. I think Abby, thank you.
Yeah. So our priorities are first of all set by deploying as best we can to meet life-saving needs. Now, in conflict areas like in northeast Nigeria. That is especially fraught, but the essence of the humanitarian enterprise starts with life-saving, and that's where our first priority is. I think the second priority is to think about the groups and the people who are doubly or trebly marginalized. And for us, we've really tried to emphasize the need to address the inequalities faced by women and girls in the circumstances where we work. We have extensive program both for survivors of gender-based violence, but also to prevent gender-based violence. I also think that the angle of thinking about inequalities faced by women and girls is relevant in areas like education, where we know from studies that when schools close, it's the girls who are least likely to return. And so the determination to try to narrow gender inequalities is a very big part of the work that we do. It's also absolutely central to our vision of economic reconstruction, because all of our experience and our evidence is that women-owned businesses can be the drivers of family and community renewal in a way that is really has outsized impact. So the second thing I would mention is the need to recognize the extra vulnerabilities, extra inequalities that are faced by various groups, including and most strikingly women and girls. The third thing that I think is really unexpected and is an area where we've taken the International Rescue Committee over the last few years is to recognize that our social programs are most impactful when they're allied with economic livelihoods programs as well. That might be village savings and loans institutions, it might programs, it might be job training programs, it might be business creation programs. But I think one of the lessons from the figures I gave you about the increasing duration of displacement and the increasingly urban nature of displacement is that we think it's really important to try to ally social interventions with economic interventions as well. And actually, done right, the economic interventions have a really outsized social impact. Finally, I think it's important to think about this in a global perspective, not just in a local perspective. One of the nice things that I think David Altshuler said at the beginning was that I tried to bring a global perspective to the work we do as well as a local one. And we think that at a time when for the first time in history, more than 1% of the world's population are now forcibly displaced. The figures I gave you of the 79.5 million people forcibly displaced, that means for the first time in human history, or at least since records began, we have a situation where more than 1 in 100 of every people in the world is forcibly displaced. Now, at that time, we have to make the argument globally, as well as in the places that we work, that this challenge needs to be managed, and it is manageable and isn't unmanageable. And at a time when nativist and nationalist politics is on the rise, I think our own experience of how these problems can be addressed and how refugees and displaced people can be assets to communities rather than a burden on communities is a really important priority. When people say to me, what's the biggest challenge you face? Even bigger than the bombing in northwest Syria, where 86 health facilities have been knocked out over the last year, including some of our own, even bigger, the biggest challenge we face is the idea that this challenge is unmanageable, and the best thing that countries can do is put up their walls and hope for the best. And so I think there's an important responsibility on us as a global humanitarian agency to show that our experience is that the choice is not whether or not there are refugees who come or not. The choice is whether or not they come legally, in an organized way, in a safe way, in a way that benefits them and the societies they land in, or whether they come in a disorderly and unsafe way. And I think that's a really important argument to make.
Just following on from that, David, and you talk about projecting the fact that there is stuff that we can do and it's not unmanageable. We have in the audience mainly grassroots organisations, smaller in scope and resource than the IRC. And I was always struck when I was working with World Jewish Relief, quite a big organisation in our terms and in terms of the people represented around this virtual table, how small it was compared to the work and scope and scale that you do. What are your views on grassroots organisations and their ability to make change and their place in the overall jigsaw?
Well, I think that the first thing I would say is that grassroots organizations are not only a feature of advanced industrialized societies like the UK. I mean, if you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and sometimes the undemocratic Republic of Congo, it's got a dense network of civil society organizations. In some of the places we work, there's a religious affiliation, in others not. So the first thing is that global civil society is important. Secondly, I think it's important to say that often we find in the work that we do, our interventions sponsor the creation of local community organization, which is a positive thing, especially actually among women's organizations that we work with. And that's, I think, a product of the fact that more than 95% of our staff are locally hired. I mean, in Syria, we've got 800 staff, just to take that as an example, and they are 800 local people. They're not Americans or anyone else being sent in. Now, I think that there's a really important challenge to the international NGOs, which, as you say, can seem big, but we're an $850 million organization compared to UNICEF or UNHCR, United Nations High Commission of Refugees. Those are $5, $6, $7, $8 billion organizations, and the overall humanitarian sector is $26 billion. So it's all about scale. Now, I can only give you our experience. We've just been through a strategy refresh. And one of the things coming out of it is the outsized impact and the outside quality that we get when we partner right with local civil society. And so I don't see this as an either or. I don't see this as quote unquote expertise coming from the global area and then person power coming locally. I see this as global expertise and local expertise coming together. But it has to be done in a way that recognizes the different strengths that come from a global perspective where we can have global evidence on what works, and a local perspective that has real context. And what we find is that it's the local intelligence, the local experience that makes for sustained effectiveness. And so, as I say, we don't program in the UK, so it's a slightly different, but if we were programming in the UK, we'd be partnering with local civil society, because that's the best way to try to make sure that you're engaging in a sustainable way with the local community. I just want to make one other point, though, which is needs to be made delicately and is important. We don't just talk about partnering with local civil society, we also talk about client engagement. And sometimes civil society is very representative of our clients, sometimes it's not. And we have to make sure that we are giving voice to those who are in civil society and organized, but also those who are not. And so if you looked at our client engagement, the way we do client engagement, it partly works through community organizations, it also works with clients themselves. And so, for example, when we did our strategy process that I just referred to, 1,000 clients were involved, as well as 90 civil society organizations. So we tried to think about our engagement with organized civil society, but also with individuals who are not part of a local organization.
You mentioned in some of your earlier remarks about the Dubs Amendment and the abandonment of that, and I have a question from Mia Bardo that touches on that, but I want to expand it a little. She asks about what you think about the situation for unaccompanied children in Europe and how the UK government could be convinced to do more. That question, and also advocacy. Advocacy feels like a very important role for your organisation and all the organisations in the room, in an environment where I think the discourse is so hostile at the moment. Any thoughts on the specific question and the broader question of advocacy?
Yeah, so let me split that into two. First of all, whoever asked the question is absolutely right to raise the point about unaccompanied minors in Europe. We're actually working in Greece. I know some of the organizations represented on this call are working in Greece. The Moria camp, I think, was built for 4,000, or the camps were built for 6,000 in total. There are 40,000 people in the camps, significant numbers of unaccompanied minors. We've been doing a lot of work to try and get unaccompanied minors out of the camps, and also to give them sponsored semi-independent living as they become older teenagers on mainland Greece. And to be fair to the European Commission, they've actually put money on the table for this, but the previous Greek government didn't use it. And so there's a real crisis there. I think that's the appropriate word to use. Secondly, in terms of advocacy, I've got some thoughts on this. I mean, the first is that the most powerful advocates are not me or you. The most powerful advocates are the refugees themselves. And one of the things we've got to do a better job is getting the experience and the voices of refugees themselves. They are the best advocates because they tackle the dehumanization on which nativism and nationalism often thrive. And so that's the first thing. Secondly, I think it's really important to be specific in advocacy. I've obviously sat on the other side of the table in government. And the least effective form of advocacy is someone who comes to tell you what you already know, which is that there's a big problem. The most effective form of advocacy is someone who comes along and says, look, we know you know there's a big problem, but here is actually a way in which you could address it in an effective way. So I think advocacy based on evidence and experience is really important. Thirdly, I think that advocacy that builds coalitions is really important. Unexpected allies are really important. And I think it's really grievous, this, I mean, obviously my mother came to the UK as a 12-year-old in 1946, having survived the war. So unaccompanied child refugees into the UK is something that means a lot to me. And I've obviously only been involved peripherally in this toing and froing around the Dubs Amendment, but obviously the fact that he came with the kinder transport speaks to this. And I think it's right for there to be a real appeal, not a hue and cry, but an appeal of a systematic kind, parliamentarian by parliamentarian, government minister by government minister, about what this represents in terms of the debt that the UK owes, also in terms of the leadership role that the UK has sometimes claimed. And thirdly, I think really importantly, the point about what the UK stands for. And at a time when many people, I mean, I'm doing some interviews at the moment about how immigration and customs enforcement in the US are detaining people, and they're catching COVID in detention, and then they're being sent to Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras. At a time when there are depredations of countries like the US, it's so important the UK doesn't go down that track. So I think it's really important to try and draw on whatever lessons you can learn from me or from others about how that can be done.
Thank you. And so I've got a question, and I think it'll probably be our last question, because we're already running out of time, regrettably, from Paul Anticoni, who's the CEO of World Jewish Relief, and I'm exercising my favoritism here to him. And he asked a question about host governments hosting vast numbers of displaced people, many of whom you say are as likely to be hosted there for years to come. And he wants to know, as a practitioner, I think, are there any examples of positive examples from these contexts which can be held up as good practice, which might encourage others to be less draconian in their refugee positioning?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that you need an intellectual frame for thinking about how refugees are supported. And I don't want to give an economics lecture, but many people know what a public good is. And hosting of refugees is a global public good. In other words, the benefit of it isn't limited to those who are doing it. It's of global benefit. And so that creates a temptation on countries to free ride on the goodwill of others. And so when you've got a global public good, you've got to have global responsibility towards it. And so in a situation where a country like Lebanon has 25% of its population as refugees, where Jordan has 10%, where Ethiopia, Uganda, Bangladesh are taking in millions of people, where countries like Turkey have got 3.7 million people, the first thing to say is that this is a global responsibility, not just a local responsibility. And I was speaking last week to the head of the International Monetary Fund. I think it's incredibly important that international financial institutions give support to these countries, even if they're middle income. If you're a middle income country, you're not entitled to debt relief. Actually, if you're hosting large numbers of refugees, you should be. So there's a global argument, which I appreciate is a long way from the practical work that's of concern maybe to World Jewish Relief and also other organizations, but I think it needs to be fitted into that frame. Secondly, I think it's really important to recognize that countries who have opened their borders, like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Bangladesh, which has took in 1 million Rohingya Muslims, like Ethiopia, for people fleeing from Eritrea, like Kenya, which has taken people from Somalia. The resilience of those countries has been very, very striking. I mean, Jordan's seen its debt to GDP ratio more or less double from 50% to 100% since the arrival of Syrian refugees. They're carrying a big burden, but they've actually lived up to, they've set an example of how you can at least live up to some of your global commitments. Now, to answer very specifically, which country has done the most? It's a slightly invidious question, but let me give you a slightly surprising answer. The country which says refugees can go anywhere in our country, the country which says if you're a refugee, you have full entitlement to use public services, health, education, etc. The country which says if you arrive in our country, we will give you land on which to make a living. That country is Uganda. And so Uganda has, in many ways, set the country which says you have an entitlement to work, because of course many countries that refugees arrive in, they're not entitled to work. Uganda has done all those things. And so there are, and by the way, the studies show that the dependence on humanitarian aid of those refugees in Uganda is quite low by international standards, and their contribution to the economy is quite high. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this, there's all sorts of aspects to it, but it is striking what they've done, and it puts to shame in various ways the debate that happens often in the richest countries in the world about the way in which this should be done. So there are good examples. I think it's also worth saying that although we're a large organization that helped over 20 million people last year, too often the help we're giving is not thoroughgoing or sustained enough. And the greatest contribution to survival and recovery is done by our clients themselves. We help them. And we need, as an international humanitarian aid sector, to do a much better job at aligning our activities for long-term impact. If all of you look at our outcomes and evidence framework, which is a publicly available guide that we use to guide our programming, it shows you that there's a long way to go before our sector works in a way that is evidence-based and impactful. And I think that's an important, as you're thinking about what different mechanisms to use, one of the reasons we're being called on to give technical advice in Germany is we've got a lot of experience from the US about what works in refugee integration. And so I think it's really important as you think about the future of this network and what you're going to do, don't feel that you have to reinvent the wheel. I think really trying to learn from what works. The IRC now does the plurality, the largest number of impact evaluation studies in the humanitarian sector. And I think it's really important that we don't expect people to reinvent the wheel. We should be following best practice, and that's what we try to do. And I hope others can do. If they're interested, rescue.org is where you can find a lot more information about it.
David, that was absolutely fantastic, so illuminating. I think so much information delivered in such a short space of time. And I'm sure sets the context brilliantly for the discussions of the next couple of days. I wonder if we could just do a little experiment to get everyone to come off mute and at least try and do a round of applause in the traditional way to say thank you to you. I hope, David, next time I see each other, we'll be in person and perhaps with different political leadership, and we can meet in more traditional and friendly circumstances.
Okay, lots of family. Take care.
Thank you.
David and James, thanks so much. Really incredible conversation, and what you packed into those 25 minutes or however long it was. Really is going to be the kernels that we can really take forward in this forum. Some big you know, the biggest, you said the biggest challenge is that this is the perception that this is unmanageable, and this is really at the heart of what JRAN is all about. That we can make things manageable as possible if we work together. And then taking that strain forward, you talked about the synergies that you get when global and local expertise comes together. Again, that's something that we really need to focus on here, how we can establish those partnerships, especially on something as you know, simple really as impact evaluation. A lot of smaller organizations struggle with that. You've mastered it. And, you know, if we really can draw on you know, some of those learnings, and if there are, you know, manuals or whatever that can be made available from IRC to some of, even the biggest of our small organizations here, we'll be able to learn significantly from. And finally, you know, the importance of engaging with individuals. That is, again, what this forum is all about. All the sessions following you are with people that have lived experience, and we're going to hear